All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. You are here for our session, What Your SOC Can't See, Mobile Threats and App Risk Intelligence. Very excited to be here today. I am Nicole with the iVerify team. We have a great session ahead. Joining us today, Rocky Cole from iVerify, Andrew Hoog from NowSecure. They're going to guide us through the session. And then we'll have a special guest. Jan Rosenfeld is joining us to run the demo. I am going to run us just very quickly through our agenda. So we'll start with introductions. We will talk about what good looks like in an enterprise mobile security program. Jan's going to come in with a demo. We're going to have a discussion between Rocky and Andrew. How did we get here? Where are we headed? And why should we care about any of this? Then we're going to end with audience questions. We want to hear from you again, so make sure you drop your questions there, okay? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rocky and Andrew. Thank you,
Wow.
guys.
Thank you, Nicole, for setting that up so nicely. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. Andy, good to see you as always.
You as
Uh,
well.
the origin of this webinar is I've known Andy a while now, and I think we're going to call this a partnership announcement, right? We're going to drop like a little bit of news here.
Sure.
But I also think that we're just going to have a discussion in public that we've had in private many times. The origin of this webinar is Andy and I spend more time talking to Andy than I do my family these days. And they're always really fascinating conversations. And I think I said one day, like, Andy, we should just have this conversation like in public because like it's the best marketing we'll have for our respective products. So that's what we're gonna do here. We're gonna have a little fireside chat, if you will. But before we do that, for those who've never met me, my name is Rocky. I'm one of the founders of a mobile EDR platform called iVerify. Like all good cyber founders, I did a tour of duty in the U.S. intelligence community at the National Security Agency. And specifically, I spent a lot of time on the offensive side of things as an R&T analyst over at the R&E building at Fort Meade. And that means I've looked behind the curtain. I've seen what APT groups actually do, how they behave and operate, what their TTPs are up close, because I've been one of those adversaries before. And I knew that there was a lot more activity in the mobile space than the public perception was. And we'll get into this in a bit. But I also knew that there wasn't actually a lot of activity in the mobile space back when I was in government. It was a little bit sleepier. Everyone was using Blackberries. Blackberries were very secure pieces of technology, very difficult to hack. And so I left government. I went over to Google for about a decade at a business unit there called Jigsaw that did a lot of really interesting prototype concept prototyping of technology to make the free and open internet safer and more scalable. And one of the things that I observed when I was there was the rise of commercial spyware vendors, companies like NSO Group in Tel Aviv, the Intellexa Alliance in Europe. And I watched private equity and venture capital pour billions of dollars into the development of capabilities specifically targeting iPhones, which was really weird, given everything I understood about the mobile security landscape. And so it led me to ask a lot of questions about the security industry. And we'll get into a lot of those conclusions in more depth here, but I'll spoil a couple of them up front. What was happening was something similar to what happened to the desktop antivirus industry 10 or 15 years ago, which is 10 or 15 years ago, everyone was using, Norton or Symantec or, one of these antivirus tools. And they had viruses all the time. And it was because large APT groups, like the National Security Agency, for example, were deploying these very sophisticated cyber exploits, sometimes 20 exploits chained together. And they proliferated. They spun out of control, and antivirus just couldn't keep up. And so what we saw happen was a pivot from antivirus to EDR, which is just to say getting really deep telemetry and detecting anomalous things, not just looking for the latest file or network-based signature that you have. And so we saw that same thing happening in the mobile space with the proliferation of commercial spyware vendors, and we made a bet that that the problem was only going to get worse, and there'd be a need for an actual EDR tool in the mobile space. So that's the origin of iVerify. That's my story. Andy, do you want to give your, if I'm the peanut butter, Andy's the jelly here. Do you want to give your version of the story?
Sure. Yeah, no, it's great to be here. So, just a quick snapshot for me. I've been technical my whole career, background in computer science, held various management roles, and then in 2008 I co-founded NowSecure. At least that's what we're called today. We started out in the mobile forensic space, and I think a reason why a lot of the synergies between our companies is because what iVerify does is really looking at that lower level telemetry, looking at the logs, the kinds of things that I would do as a forensics expert when I was doing investigations. So we started the company. I wrote 2 books on the topic, one of them with my co-author, Katie Bochnowski, and have a number of patents in the space. But as we were doing the investigations, we found lots of sensitive data at rest on these devices, and certainly nothing that would help the companies or the users or anything of that sort. So really, this was just kind of data laying around that put companies at risk. So we expanded the aperture of the company, and we started focusing on mobile app security testing. We became pen testers. We wrote software to do that more efficiently, and ultimately we built an automated system that tests mobile apps at scale on real devices, doing both static analysis and dynamic, so actually running the applications. And we've been doing that for a long time now. We support a lot of very large customers and different governments, helping them look for risk in the mobile supply chain and mobile apps. And when Rocky and I got introduced a number of years ago as kind of just co-founders and helping each other out in that regard, we kind of slowly began to see an opportunity to work together. So I'm really excited for our webinar today to kind of take you through what we've learned in our decades of experience here, and really what folks need to have to kind of deal with the risks that are here today, and certainly coming at a much greater clip here in the future.
Amazing. So hopefully by the time you're done listening to Andy and I chit chat, you'll come away from this webinar with certainly a really good sense of what a complete view of mobile risk looks like. But you'll also have an idea of how OS level detection and continuous app intelligence seamlessly combined into one security picture. And hopefully that leads to actionable threat context. It leads to not just detections, but it leads you in the direction of being able to actually respond to these kinds of threats and take meaningful action. And then finally, you'll get a live demo of the platform because, surprise, iVerify and NowSecure have formed a deep partnership. I mentioned peanut butter and jelly. That's exactly, they're both pretty good by themselves, but they're even better when you put them together on some really good bread. And we have an interesting story to tell here about how that Andy once walked away from an MTD platform, and I came into the mobile EDR business. Frankly, I had a blind spot. I thought the app risk business was a little bit sleepy, and then not only was I wrong about that, and was he wrong about EDR, the landscape's also changed, making both of these topics kind of relevant at the same time. So you'll get a sense of how this deep partnership that we've formed together is highly complementary, and not just in terms of the problems that we're solving, but in terms of the I think you'll hear as Andy and I chat, there's a sort of a deep cultural similarity between our two organizations as well. That's why we get along so well. So I think you'll see all of that.
Yeah, this is an interesting.
Go ahead.
A lot going on here. So Rocky and I were sketching out the idea of how to approach this, and we worked with the marketing team at iVerify, who did a fantastic job taking like sketches and ideas. And really, I think a big takeaway here is that there is a lot going on mobile apps, and mobile devices that folks don't realize. As Rocky mentioned, and we'll get into this later, I killed an MTD product many, many years ago when I did not believe the telemetry that we were able to pull at that time was going to be sufficient to really drive visibility into risk. And that's really what changed for me in the partnership with iVerify, is their approach to kernel adjacent telemetry and behavior and analytics is really the thing that I wanted to build back in 2010, but we just weren't able to do. And like Rocky mentioned, and we'll get into this, mobile apps are typically overlooked. People say, well, the app in Google Play and the Apple App Store have vetted these. We're okay. We don't have to worry about it. But a really simple example would be, imagine you have a very secure device, and you have an application that encrypts everything and follows all the best practices, but it's actually collecting all of your sensitive IP or your contacts or your text messages and then sending them out, egressing them to a country or to an actor you don't want to. That is clearly a risk within the business. So as we kind of thought about mobile security and what does kind of full spectrum visibility look like, it really boils down to two major tenets, right? You need to understand the overall device and its health and what's going on in the telemetry behind that. And you need to understand the apps themselves. So we kind of put together this picture. You guys can come back and take a look when we share the slides, but it really represents what the combination of these two platforms are doing best of breed, and how when they come together, it can really drive real-time risk mitigation by doing things like conditional access and whatnot, and taking all of these signals coming in both from the device and from the apps, and using that to make a risk decision and enforcing it throughout the enterprise. So that was my quick take on this very busy slide, Rock. I don't know if you have other things.
Sure. I'll do my side of it. I mean, let me start with sort of our platform, and then I'll talk about, the gaps that our partnership fills. I mean, so I mentioned, in my sort of introductory remarks that something is happening to the mobile space now that happened to desktop 10 or 15 years ago. Let me give you a really specific example of this. Wind back the clock 10 years to 2016. Isn't it wild that 2016 was 10 years ago, first of all? Like, doesn't that make you feel just like supremely old? Anyway, the talk of the town in mobile security was Pegasus, right? Pegasus had just sprung on the scene. And for the most part, Pegasus is a lawful intercept tool sold by NSO Group around the world to largely police and intelligence agencies to do lawful intercept. But there's a couple things that are noting here. First of all, lawful intercept means different things in different countries. One person's lawful intercept is another person snooping. Another thing is they didn't do a very good job controlling their supply chain. They didn't vet their end users really well. And as a result, there was considerable abuse of these tools. That's been very well documented in the press. Politicians, journalists, members of civil society have all fallen victim to commercial spyware, the abuse of commercial spyware. And that's a very well-established and proven fact. You can read, about this. You read about these cases, in the works of the Citizen Lab and Amnesty International and people like that, and organizations and people like that. But what that led to is the third thing is the proliferation of these tools. There's kind of this myth in the mobile security world that, an iPhone is an unhackable computer. It's never been true. What has been true is that they've done a pretty good job, securing their platform. As good a job, I think, as any company can do by themselves. But I think we've probably moved a little bit outside the realm of when it's appropriate for one company making one of the largest operating systems on the planet to have a sort of a go it alone attitude. And the result of that is that there's this labor market now that's sprung up around the development of mobile spyware. It's commercialized at scale, and it's rather large, to the point where the evolution of spyware, it started with a few commercial spyware vendors abusing, having their technology abused by authoritarian regimes and anyone willing to pay the highest price. It then moved into the APT realm. We saw, for example, last year and during the last presidential cycle, like we actually found threat actors likely associated with China using mobile spyware to spy on, the most senior people of the presidential campaigns in America. And then this year, we saw the first ever mass scale attacks using iOS spyware distributed via watering holes around the world. I'm talking about the Karuna and Darksword exploits. These were, in the case of Karuna, it was a tool that was built by Trenchant here in the United States. In the case of Darksword, probably this firm called Dark Matter that was based in UAE. But either way, they were these very elegant, very sophisticated spyware tools that made their way onto the secondary market, the secondary exploit market, and were used by just petty criminals around the world to steal cryptocurrency, steal information, steal passwords, logins, just standard cybercrime for financial gain. And that was a first. OS exploitation on phones has moved from the realm of highly targeted against VIPs, against the most hardened targets, to like a frontline tool that your average criminal is using as part of their is one of their daily go-tos. And that changes the model of what's needed for securing a phone. Until I think this became a mass threat, most businesses could assume that as long as they just stayed up to date on patching on an iPhone in particular, that was really all they needed to do. So you saw, adoption of tools like MDM, tools of MAM, mobile application management. The idea being you can't access corporate data unless the phone is, up to date on the latest patch. But the problem is that tools like DarkSword don't jailbreak the device. They don't, these are mass attacks that in some cases used O days or even N days. So you can't entirely rely on looking at just patching and jailbreaking as your sole solution. And then you move even further into the future and you think about what Mythos is doing to the time to deployment of vulnerabilities, going from discovery to implementation to exploitation. I've seen charts, I wish I had one here, that shows that that metric just plummeting, frankly. And you have to think it's going to get very, very fast. And I know because we're doing this ourselves, like we're in OpenAI's Trusted Access for Cyber program. I mean, we're using these tools, we're finding stuff, and it's not taking us long to find it. So the world of patching and management as your only solution on a phone, that world's over. If that's what you're doing, you're really far behind and you're going to get breached. But what do you do? I've told you what not to do. Well, the answer is really to try to get as close as you can to an EDR capability on a mobile device that detects weird things, not just signatures. By the time we catch Karuna and DarkSword and pull the one or two files out of it, that may be a useful detection. There's two problems with that. A, you've been breached a long time ago because it's been circulating in the wild. And B, in the case of DarkSword, or I guess two in the case of DarkSword, there weren't really file-based signatures, and there were very few network-based signatures. The thing about DarkSword is it hooks into legitimate system processes and exfiltrates data by inheriting the privileges of the system, of the processes that it hooks into. And like, that's what happened on desktop, right? That's why companies like CrowdStrike and S1 got really big, because they can look at that anomalous behavior. So that's what we do on our side. We start from the premise of, at least on an iPhone, the internals of iPhones are remarkably consistent across versions and across time. And as a result, if you get the right telemetry, it's like very easy to find things that shouldn't be there. But you do have to get the telemetry in the first place, and you have to process it in the right way to look for anomalies. And so that's what we do. We collect as much, we call it kernel adjacent telemetry. It's not kernel telemetry because we're not ourselves jailbreaking the device and sitting inside the kernel with the driver like CrowdStrike might do. But we are certainly collecting vast amounts of logging data, such as crash logs. We're looking at memory data. We're looking at the filing system. We're looking at processes that are executing in real time. And all this is time series data. And you put that against a baseline of what normal looks like from our, very, very large user base of both enterprises and consumers around the world. It makes it very easy for us to surface things that are just anomalous and that our threat hunting team can dive into. And so we've moved from looking for just signatures on either, looking for things like a jailbreak or file or network-based signature, to looking at the actual system itself and finding things that shouldn't be there, detecting it, containing it, investigating it, and then remediating it. And it's as close as you can get to EDR on a mobile device. Andy, do you want to add anything on your end?
I would kind of wrap it up because I know we're about to pop into the demo and show it. I think the key here is well highlighted. This is about visibility. And, traditionally on mobile, it was built in a different way, and we simply didn't have visibility. And we had a high degree of confidence that the platforms are fairly secure and weren't highly targeted. We know this not to be true anymore. And so the question is how do you drive visibility? And once you have the visibility, you can't unsee what Rocky and I see on a daily basis, which is there is significant risk here. There's real data being egressed. AI is kind of prevalent everywhere across the stack. And there's anomalous behavior that is driving risk. So really the big question here is how, on a platform that's more limited, right? We can't get root the way that you can on these devices. Do you drive visibility? And that's really what this story is about. When your security teams and your SOC teams have this level of visibility, it will really change the game for them, not only to kind of continuously address that risk, but to make better informed decisions, more broadly on mobile, so that you can leverage the value and the strength of it, but not take all the risks, at least not with blindfolds on. So I think that was a great overview, Rocky, and I know we're going to show, not tell, and then kind of have a discussion, and we certainly welcome questions from any of the attendees.
Great. Well, Jan, with that, do you want to do a quick demo?
Certainly. I'll go ahead and share my screen. What I'm going to show today is the iVerify and NowSecure integration. So you'll be looking at the iVerify platform, but you will see elements of the NowSecure platform integrated into the data. I'll be primarily focusing on our analysis of the applications on the device, where we're getting that information from, and then how you can remediate issues in your environment using the tools at your disposal. So I'll go ahead and share my screen very quickly. And you should be seeing the iVerify application list here. Now, iVerify is performing risk analysis on the permissions requested by the applications installed on a device, a mobile device. The analysis runs 6 weighted checks to produce an overall risk score between 0 and 1. And this score reflects the potential risk implied by the combination of permissions that the app is requesting. How do we collect this inventory? So this is an important question, and it differs by operating system. For Android, we collect it from the associated container on the device. So in a typical Android deployment, as you can see here on my screen, if iVerify is installed in, for example, the work container on an Android device, we're collecting the app list from the work container. If it's on the personal side, or if it's simply installed on the device in a BYOD context, we collect the entire app list. On iOS, it's a little more controlled by Apple. So we collect inventory from managed devices via the MDM integration that iVerify has. So that's where we're pulling the app list and associated information from. Now, what you're seeing in this list here is the application list for my mobile fleet in aggregate. You can also choose a specific device and drill into the application list on that device, but I prefer to show it across my entire fleet. You'll see here that I've sorted the applications by NowSecure's risk rating, so worst at the top. And what you're seeing here is the application name, the bundle ID, or the package name rather. You see active installs across the devices. You see historical installs across your mobile devices, and you see a full count of the permissions requested by the application. The permission score I'll pick on DeepSeek as an example here. The permission score is actually relatively good in this case. So we're requesting 12 permissions, and we give that a risk score of a permission score of 23. However, NowSecure is rating the safety of this application, or the construction of this application, pretty low, as an F. So why don't we double click on DeepSeek and drill into that analysis. When I come into an application, as you can see here, we get a breakdown of the permission checks. We codify them in different categories. So you'll see here surveillance. These are things like, camera and microphone. These are permissions being requested by the application. For an AI assistant application, this makes sense, right? It wants to access your camera and microphone because it wants to analyze a photo or do a voice assistant song and dance, things like that. Data exfiltration, access to the internet, of course, system control. It can change the network state, change the Wi-Fi state. So we're sort of breaking down the permissions by category. Of course, you can view these permissions as a aggregated list if you don't want to categorize them, and you can search through that list as well. But I think where the information really gets interesting is if you access the NowSecure Mari data. So if I click on the NowSecure panel, we see a flyout here that breaks down the construction of the app and the associated risk. I'll just choose a couple categories at random here. I would expect an AI assistant to use cloud-based artificial intelligence, so that's why you're seeing this come up at the very top. But for the authentication section, we can see that NowSecure's detected credential patterns hard-coded into the app package, which is relatively unsafe. If I scroll down to, for example, the privacy section of the application analysis, we can see, for example, that it contains network connections that reach out to dangerous jurisdictions, right? So all of this information can be aggregated and integrated into your risk tolerance and your application protection policies and your conditional access policies through iVerify's integration with various MDM tools or network level tools. I wanted to sort of close this out with some of the things that we can action on. So you get a lot of information through our platform and through the integration with NowSecure's platform. And so with this information, to start, you'll be able to, of course, block apps explicitly by their package name or device ID. You can set a threshold-based blocking rule. So, for example, if the permission score is too low or the NowSecure risk rating is a D or below, that can break your mobile policy. You can block apps that connect to adversarial networks, as we're seeing here in this example. For example, block apps that contain AI functionality, if that's something that you're trying to mitigate your risk on in your environment. And then, of course, you can do all the enterprise bells and whistles, like explicitly carve allow lists for specific apps that you always want to allow or always want to block in your environment. And if any of these policies are broken, you can hit all of your conditional access policies for MDM managed devices, your conditional launch policies for MAM enrolled devices, or simply deny access to corporate resources via an identity provider like Okta or Microsoft Entra if you're unmanaged completely. So that's a very quick walkthrough of some of the data that we're seeing here, and I will throw back to Rocky and Andrew to continue on.
Very well. So I think that's pretty much it as far as the demo and the sort of the introduction. I mean, I think I want to reserve the majority of time here for audience questions if we have any. So I think first, go ahead and if you have questions, please go ahead and raise your hand, put them in the chat. I know we also have some pre-submitted questions we can get to, but before we do get to those, I do just want to ask kind of one sort of framing question to Andy. I mentioned that whenever we founded iVerify, we kind of apps were a blind spot to us. We thought they were kind of sleepy, that Apple and Google had kind of cracked the nut on this. But the reason we reached out to you guys is just time and time again, we were talking to customers, and this was top of mind for them. This was something they really cared about. And some of it's compliance, some of it is, we live in an increasingly fractured geopolitical world. Supply chain risk is something that matters. But I have kind of a more high level question for you, which is, it looks like vibe coding is going to be a thing, right? Mm-hmm. And you often hear about that in the context of enterprise apps, but you never really see it discussed much in the context of mobile apps. I know Apple banned a vibe coding platform from the App Store not that long ago, but it's just not as widely discussed as desktop applications. So my question is, what are you seeing in terms of vibe coded mobile apps, and how are you thinking about that problem? And is sort of the reinvigoration of the App Store because of the democratization of coding, like, does that present like a new set of enterprise risk challenges that maybe people haven't had to tackle before?
Yeah, no, I think the short answer is absolutely. We're seeing a big uptick in, it's not just us, right? You could go out there and look at lines of code checked into GitHub. I think in the course of a year, it did a 10x, 7x, something like that. It was astronomical. And as folks, I'm a data of AI as a coding tool, and day to day, I'm sure many people here are as well. So as a lot of us know, like, the pattern matching is, looking at code that other people have written, and we know that humans write code that has problems. So what we found is that there's definitely an increase in app. There's an increase in the amount of code that's written, and there's a decrease in the amount of kind of attention and understanding that goes into building that. And that is not a good recipe from a security standpoint. I think that enterprises can certainly look at certain policies of, like, how long has an app been around and what's the long tail and do we want to install these things, but really many platforms are starting to use kind of vibe coding, and I think it's easy to overlook small subtle problems because mobile security has been sleepy, Rocky, as you mentioned. It just hasn't gotten the attention, and folks really don't have an appreciation for what's going on behind the scenes. We have millions of ODAs, if you will, sitting in our database. We test thousands of apps every day from the public stores. We find significant issues in those apps, and 8 or 10 years ago, we tried to start disclosing that to MITRE at the time from a CVE perspective. And even 8 years ago, when they were fully staffed and funded, they said, stop, don't do it. We the volume to keep up with these. So what we're seeing is just a very, very significant level of security issues, or said more broadly, privacy and other risks where data, enterprise data, identity, et cetera, is put at risk because the applications aren't vetted. So so we're definitely seeing that uptake.
One question that was submitted from the audience, I think, is related to this. It says, speaking of vibe coding, it says, can your solution discover unsanctioned apps in use by employees in both an iOS and Android context? How does that fit into sort of the mobile application risk intelligence data set that you've created?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's honestly a combination of the two platforms, right? So we don't get inventory on people's devices, right? We are bespoke, deeply focused on kind of exercising and testing mobile apps as deeply as possible. And so we're going to go out there, we're going to install these on real devices, we're going to test them, and we're going to pull back significant telemetry, and we're going to use that to make a much broader view of what the overall risk is. Now, when so we don't integrate into the device itself, and that's why this partnership has been so strong. Not only are you guys on the devices seeing what's happening and have access to it, you tie into different MDM systems, and you can then even do things like take action, right? So we can say there's all of these issues over here, but how do you go take action? So back to the original question, I think the long tail comes out, clearly from the app inventory. We can determine, have other people, have we tested this app before? Has anybody else requested it? What's the overall code quality? What are the risks of this application? But I think from that specific, I think that the iVerify capability is going to obviously help folks spot those applications, in the fleet.
Yeah, and what I like about this is, if I look at previously, before we had this partnership, a customer asked me this question, I would really say, well, you've got 3 options, right? You can just block App Store access entirely and say, no apps for you. And the problem with that is it really reduces productivity, and not only productivity, but like employee satisfaction, right? Like it makes your mobile device just significant. Like why have them at that point, right?
Right.
The second option is to I guess there's really 2 options, that or whitelisting. So you can block the App Store access, but then have like approved apps that are either first party enterprise apps built by the organization, or do this like very difficult sort of manual forensic process to go through and parse the apps manually, which as you're still very limited in what you can do from a productivity perspective. But it also creates this additional sort of operational overhead of now you have to use open source tools in some cases. We've seen people using like open source tools, right? To and have teams that literally they get a request from their workforce. Oh, I want to use this app. Well, then the security team has to go pull that app down. They have to run it through a manual tool and say, this app looks good, or it's conforming to policy or not conforming to policy. But then a new version of that app will come out and they have to do the whole exercise over again. So as they allow more and more apps, the overhead just grows kind of exponentially. And so as a result, you don't see a lot of appetite for that. So you tend to just see people either just saying, screw it, we're just going to go wild and let all apps be used, or we're going to be very restrictive and only allow a few apps. And so what I like about what you guys do and what this partnership enables with the Mari data is it allows kind of a third way, which is to keep the App Store open, but still have really granular real-time access into the risks that are in those apps, and then set really granular policies. Like maybe you actually don't care about supply chain, but you care deeply about whether there's AI running in the app, right? Like that's the kind of flag and the kind of rule that your data flags that, and then our engine allows you to set policies and rules around that and feed that back to the MDM. So it's just a very nice enhancement to not only the user experience and then the workplace, but productivity as well.
Yeah, I think you've hit a couple important points. So one thing I'll also add is that we also test every version of the app. So some teams that have stood up an internal process, they generally don't have the mobile expertise, they don't have the tooling, the budget, the time, and they might vet the app once a year. A lot of times it's vetted once and for the app every single time that it comes out. But I think both of the ones you've described, we've seen companies and agencies take those different paths. What I really like about the combination of the two platforms is, one, we want to drive productivity and efficiency into a company. So you want them to use this device. And with sufficient visibility into the health of the device and the app, you're comfortable with them using it. That's a good thing for the business. It's a good thing to accelerate things. So the ability to kind of get that up-to-date assessment and then conditionally allow access or go remediate or deal with something or block it is the perfect combination, because now you've driven efficiency into the organization. You've reduced the overhead that it takes to keep up with these things, and you have a higher level of confidence that, should something violate policy or introduce risk into the organization beyond a threshold that you've set, that you can effectively address that without a human in the loop. Like, as soon as the device score, the app score fall below these thresholds, you can immediately go take certain access, right? Anywhere from draconian access to removing an app or isolating it or whatever. So, it really is the best of, which is why I think that, mobile is going to continue to proliferate. And as people have visibility, one, they'll probably initially be shocked at how much is going on. I think that's what happened with Corona and Dark Sword. And maybe not everyone this webinar is aware of it, but really to emphasize it went commercial, it went mainstream. And if you follow Mythos and GPT-5.5 and whatnot, it has, it's been well stated, and you guys can corroborate it as researchers yourselves, that Apple and Android are not immune to this. So we're going to start to see more and more of these exploits occurring. And effectively right now, you're operating blindly. And I was speaking with some folks the other day that said, hey, they've been compromised on fully patched systems. It's just not enough to say we're patched. You have to be actively looking at these systems. Let me effectively become, testing my own supply chain, and again, drive visibility into the platform telemetry so that you know the posture of the device.
You mentioned something there briefly. You mentioned sort of Android versus iOS. That's not really something most of the remarks we've made so far have been really specific to iOS, frankly. But there are some differences here that are worth getting into. I mean, you can argue that historically, Apple has probably done a little bit better of a job with their App Store than Google, but you could maybe make the kind of the opposite argument about the operating system. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy. What's your take on that? I mean, do you think about app risk differently in an Android environment than an iOS environment?
I do, and I'll have to credit you with a lot of this in the platform. But I think what you've said in the past, and it makes a lot of sense, is that Apple's done a pretty good job of the fortress. But once you get inside, you're effectively blind, right? And so if somebody can figure out some sort of way to compromise the system or to get an application on there and start to exfil data, you effectively don't know what's going on. Google's had the perennial malware problem, right? So there's an issue. It's easy for people to kind of decompile the app, change it, repush it, go to third-party markets, et cetera. Although we see that coming for Apple with the forced opening of third-party app stores. But Android is much better, right? Given the Linux roots and Google and whatnot at driving that kind of insight and that telemetry, effectively giving the defenders some sort of visibility into the platform. I think that we're seeing both of these evolve. My very strong advice to security conscious companies is, if security and risk of mobile is important to you, you really only have two choices. You either need to be on a Pixel or you need to be on an iPhone. Because when you push their ecosystems, they simply can't keep up with the patch cadence that's required, especially in a kind of AI-driven vulnerability world now. So of them is each having their kind of unique upsides and downsides. Neither one of them is positioned as they need to be. And I think if there's any good things that really come out of the whole attention that Mythos and GPT-5.5 and whatnot are driving, is people saying, like, we're not going to take the vendor's word for it anymore, whether that's Apple and Google, whether that's the app developers themselves. And so if you're on one of those two platforms, I think you're reasonably well positioned to defend yourself. but they each kind of have their individual trade-offs.
Yeah, the issues with Android strike me as the historical issues have had a lot in common, I would argue, with sort of the desktop ecosystems, particularly like the Windows ecosystem, right? Where like the real vulnerability, like the reason EDR exists on Windows machines is because of the deep fragmentation of that ecosystem with many third-party vendors operating on a single platform, right? And the amount of risk that introduces to the enterprise is like it just becomes a Gordian knot. That's, you can't sort of patch and policy your way out of it. Like you really do need to have some insurance there as a backup in case you miss something. And that's the history of EDR. The Android ecosystem looks a lot like that, right? There's a lot of SKUs of Android. There's a lot of different app makers. And so that has led sort of this analogy that like, an Android device, also because it, has a Linux kernel, right? Like there more parallels with sort of that Windows ecosystem. And that's historically where I think a lot of the mobile security world has focused, both in the app space and to some degree at the operating system level. But the really interesting thing that I started, my remarks by saying I started my career on the offensive side. Here's the thing about Apple products that I think the average maybe person doesn't understand. The same attributes of Android that make it in some ways easier to defend, meaning that like open ecosystem, that sort of open ecosystem, whatever, in some ways make it harder to exploit at scale, because then you have to have sort of an infinite number of, similar to how there's an infinite number of SKUs of Android, well then you have to have sort of an infinite number of SKUs of your malware tool. And so it makes it a little bit more expensive to do it at scale, as where an iPhone, as Andy mentioned, once you get past the fairly robust defenses that are put up around those internet-facing processes, like the blast door, for example. Like once you get around those, the inside of iPhones around the world look very similar. And it's, in some ways, it's an attacker's dream because your tool works everywhere, and you don't have to have a special tool to work around this process, or a special tool to work around that process. It's just your tool is your tool. And so I think that a lot of people don't get that about an iPhone. That's why I wanted to just clarify what I mean by like iOS is, in some ways I think a more vulnerable operating system. It's more vulnerable, not because that the platform does, an inferior job defending it, but the very homogeneous nature of the way the code is written and structured and the databases are written and structured really give an attacker like a big leg up in a way that they don't have on a fragmented platform.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Rocky, I think we have time for one more question. And if you don't mind me just reading it off here, and then we can wrap up, if that sounds good to you guys.
Do it.
All right. In BYOD environments, are employees pushing back on monitoring due to privacy concerns?
Oh boy, that is a really interesting question. I mean, certainly historically, people have thought of their phones as like something that's not a computer, right? And and indeed, if you think about an iPhone, like it is a consumer device more than it's an enterprise device, right? And it's got the same security model, right? The issue of spyware is a sort of a direct result of the fact that the iPhone doesn't have a security framework on it the same way that like a MacBook does, right? So there's this expectation of privacy, in particular on an iPhone, that I don't think people have to their desktop machines. I would say early when we got started, you saw a lot of this. You saw well, we're not going to have a security tool on my phone because it invades my privacy. But I think there's two things I want to point out. One is like security and privacy aren't in contradiction necessarily. And the second thing is, when you are talking about privacy, you want, privacy from who? Privacy from, the cyber criminals that are trying to steal your data, or privacy from your employer. I mean, obviously you want both, but my point is the water is being a little muddied by the just pretty significant rise in attacks against phones. And so I think what we're seeing is sort of a changing attitude towards this. Like when we first founded the company, 4 years ago, I would say we thought, BYO was going to be an opportunity and a headwind for us. I think what we've turned out is it just ended up to be neutral, right? Because the telemetry you need to detect attacks isn't really privacy invasive. And there's certainly some things you have to be careful about. apps actually being one of them. But I think we're seeing that people are starting to come around to realize that because security doesn't need to be privacy invasive, it's probably better to have the security. I mean, Andy, I don't know. What do you have a different take on that?
Oh, I think you're spot on. I think that there's an education that has to happen, right? I think that if some people look at this and think about how much of their life, their work life, their personal life, their kids, their family, their friends, is encapsulated in this device, and if they pause for a moment and recognize that this is being targeted by criminal actors, and of course we've got the normal kind of surveillance collection that goes on in the app ecosystem and whatnot, it's kind of an eye-opener for them. So on one hand, you could kind of argue to folks that, listen, if we're able to build trust and tell you these are the types of things that we're monitoring and why, right? So you feel comfortable it doesn't know these other things. This is actually a good thing because you're getting enterprise level security, and it's not just protecting the company and the assets the company has on that device, but it's protecting everything that you care the most about, right? Yourself, your family, your friends, etc. It is a challenge to build that trust. And I do think you're right. We see a big pushback on apps. There's obvious things. There's lifestyle apps out there that people would just say, look, I'm just not comfortable with that. So I think it just kind of depends, right, for different folks. But the reality of it is that apps introduce a significant amount of risk, both to organizations and to individuals. And that I think increasingly people are saying, I would rather be informed about these risks, than to kind of stick my head in the sand and not worry about it. So it can be tenuous. Of course, a lot of government agencies get around it with GFE and just issuing their own devices. So there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of play that out. But
Right. I was going to say, I think that's one of the things, people have been predicting for years BYOD is going to go away. And then the next year you'll hear people prognosticate and say everything's going to be BYOD. I think the truth is there's going to be both the corporate devices and BYOD, and they're just both here to stay. And security teams are just going to have to continue to keep educating, I think, the workforce on the idea that, like, you can make a trade-off. You don't have to use your personal device for work, but if you do, if to access corporate data, it needs to meet a certain standard of security, right? And I think that's going to be on the security leaders of companies to just sort of take a stand and say, you can have a work device or you can secure your device and access corporate resources. But what we're not going to do is access corporate resources in an insecure way. And I increasingly see security leaders moving in that direction. Not every business is there yet, but I think that we will eventually be there.
Yep, completely agree.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. That was such a great presentation. I want to leave the audience with a call to action here. So your next step, our recommendation is set up a mobile threat briefing with us. I'm sure Rocky and Andrew would be happy to host that, and we can tailor that to your security program and show you what a clear path forward is and how to build this program of what good looks like. So if you're interested in this, just send an email to marketing@iverify.io. And we will get that set up. I want to thank both Rocky and Andrew again for joining us, and Jan for the great demo that he delivered. Really appreciate everyone taking the time once again to join us. You'll get the recording, share it with your team. It's really valuable information, so please pass that along to anyone who you think would be interested in that. Any final thoughts before we wrap up, Rocky and Andrew, or feel free to just sign off.
It's just good to spend time with you, Andy. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, great to catch up. And I would say I hope this piqued people's interest. There is a lot going on in mobile. We could show that to you relatively quickly, and I think it'll have a big impact on your organization. So we welcome y'all to just reach out and set a follow-up with us. So thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Bye.